The mop bucket wheels squeaked their familiar rhythm down the sterile hallway of Naval Base Coronado as Marcus Sullivan pushed it toward the administration building. At 58, his weathered hands gripped the handle with the same steady precision they had once held far different tools, though nobody here would ever guess that. To them, he was simply Mac the janitor, invisible as the shadows he worked in during the early morning hours. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh angles across his lined face as he methodically cleaned each section of floor. His gray maintenance uniform hung loose on a frame that had once been broader, more commanding, but time and circumstance had a way of reshaping a man. The base was stirring to life around him, officers striding past with their morning coffee and important destinations, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the building itself. Mac had learned to appreciate this invisibility over the past 3 years. There was a strange peace in being overlooked, in moving through the world unnoticed and unchallenged. He had grown tired of attention, tired of the weight that came with recognition. Here, mopping floors and emptying trash cans, he could simply exist without the burden of expectation or the complexity of command decisions that had once defined his every waking moment. The sound of sharp heels clicking against the polished floor announced the approach of Karen Hayes, the facility manager whose efficiency was matched only by her disdain for what she considered unnecessary expenses. Mac continued his work, knowing she would speak as if he were not there, a habit she had perfected over the months since taking the position. She was speaking into her phone, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never learned the difference between managing things and leading people. "Budget cuts are coming down from above," she was saying. "We need to trim the fat, starting with redundant positions. The maintenance staff is bloated, particularly the older workers who cost more in benefits than they provide in productivity." Mac's hands never paused in their work, but something deep in his chest tightened at the casual dismissal in her tone. He had heard variations of this conversation before, floating through the air like smoke, never quite directed at him but always carrying the implicit threat. In her world, he was nothing more than a line item on a budget sheet, a number to be reduced when efficiency demanded it. The morning routine continued as it had for over 1,000 days before this one. Mac emptied wastebaskets, refilled soap dispensers, and ensured that every surface gleamed with the kind of attention to detail that had been drilled into him decades earlier in a very different context. Young sailors passed by, some nodding respectfully at the older man who kept their workspace spotless, others too focused on their own concerns to acknowledge his presence. "Where in the world are you right now, and have you ever noticed how some of the most important people in your life might be the ones you walk past every day without really seeing them? Sometimes the most extraordinary stories hide behind the most ordinary faces." As the base fully awakened around him, Mac Sullivan continued his quiet work, unaware that today would be different from all the others, unaware that the careful invisibility he had cultivated was about to be shattered by a chance encounter that would reveal truths he had buried beneath years of deliberate obscurity. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the maintenance office as Mac organized his supplies for the evening shift. The small space smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee, a combination that had become as familiar to him as the sound of his own breathing. His co-workers chatted quietly among themselves, discussing weekend plans and family obligations with the easy camaraderie of people who understood the value of honest work. Tommy Reeves, barely 22 and fresh out of basic training, was assigned to shadow Mac for the week as part of his facility orientation. The young man watched with obvious confusion as Mac approached each task with military precision, wondering why a janitor would fold cleaning rags into perfect squares or arrange tools with such methodical care. "Why do you do everything so exactly?" Tommy asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "My dad always said good enough was good enough for cleaning work." Mac paused, considering his answer carefully. "Habits," he said simply. "Once you learn to do something right, it becomes harder to do it wrong than to do it correctly." The young man nodded uncertainly, not quite understanding but sensing there was more beneath the surface of the older man's quiet discipline. The radio crackled with facility announcements throughout the day, a constant stream of protocol updates and administrative notices that most workers tuned out after their first week. But Mac listened to each one with focused attention, cataloging information with the instinctive awareness of someone trained to notice details others might miss. When maintenance requests came through, he responded with an efficiency that surprised supervisors who had grown accustomed to slower response times from the civilian contractors. Karen Hayes appeared again near closing time, her expression tight with the kind of stress that came from pressure applied from above. She carried a manila folder thick with documents, her steps quick and purposeful as she headed toward the maintenance supervisor's office. Through the thin walls, her voice carried clearly as she discussed personnel evaluations and cost-cutting measures that would take effect within the month. The older workers are the obvious targets, she explained to the supervisor. Higher wages, more expensive benefits, and frankly, less adaptability to new procedures. We can replace them with younger staff at 60% of the cost. It is simply a matter of business efficiency. Mac continued sorting his equipment, but Tommy noticed the way the older man's movements became more deliberate, more controlled, as if he were consciously managing some internal response to the conversation. There was something in Mac's stillness that reminded the young man of the way experienced NCOs carried themselves, a quality of contained readiness that seemed at odds with his civilian maintenance uniform. The discussion in the supervisor's office grew more specific, with Hayes mentioning individual employees by name and outlining the timeline for their termination. Mac's name came up twice, with particular emphasis on his age and the cost of his medical benefits. The facility manager spoke of him as if he were an outdated piece of equipment, something that had served its purpose but now represented an inefficient allocation of resources. When Hayes finally left, the maintenance office fell into uncomfortable silence. Tommy looked at Mac with new eyes, recognizing something he had not seen before in the older man's quiet dignity. There was no bitterness in Mac's expression, no anger or resentment, just the same steady composure he brought to every aspect of his work. "You okay, Mr. Sullivan?" Tommy asked quietly. Mac nodded, securing the last of his equipment in its designated place. 3 years is a good run for any position, he said matter-of-factly. Sometimes it is time to move on before others decide for you. His voice carried no self-pity, just the practical acceptance of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than unemployment. As they prepared to leave for the day, Tommy found himself studying the older man more carefully. There was something about the way Mac moved, the way he held himself, that suggested experiences far beyond what his current job would indicate. The precision in his work, the alert way he processed information, the calm acceptance of adversity, all pointed to a background that remained mysteriously undefined. The base around them continued its evening routine, personnel heading home to families and civilian lives, leaving behind the structured world of military discipline for a few precious hours of personal freedom. Mac walked toward the parking lot with the same measured pace he brought to everything else, unaware that tomorrow would bring challenges that would test the careful boundaries he had built around his new life. The notification arrived on Mac's work tablet Tuesday morning with the cold efficiency of bureaucracy. Report to Human Resources at 1,400 hours for performance review and position evaluation. The message was signed by Karen Hayes, though Mac knew she had likely sent identical notifications to half the maintenance staff scheduled for termination. Mac continued his morning routine without visible reaction, but Tommy noticed the subtle change in his demeanor. The younger man had developed an eye for reading people during his brief military service, and something in Mac's controlled stillness suggested this was not unexpected news. There was no surprise in the older man's expression, just the quiet preparation of someone who had faced difficult briefings before. The morning passed with unusual tension in the maintenance department. Word had spread about the afternoon meetings, creating an undercurrent of nervous energy among the civilian staff. Some workers spoke in hushed tones about union representatives and severance packages, while others simply focused on their tasks with the grim determination of people trying to appear indispensable. Mac approached his work with the same methodical precision as always, but Tommy began to notice details that had previously escaped his attention. The way Mac instinctively positioned himself to observe all entrances to any room they entered. How his eyes automatically catalogued potential hazards and security vulnerabilities with each new location. The unconscious habit of checking his 6 o'clock position whenever footsteps approached from behind. During their lunch break in the small maintenance office, Tommy finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building in his mind for days. "Mr. Sullivan," he said carefully, you were military before this, weren't you? Mac looked up from his sandwich, considering the young man with new attention. What makes you think that? He asked neutrally. Tommy struggled to articulate what he had observed. It is the way you carry yourself, he said. The way you notice things. My drill instructor moved like you do, like he was always ready for something. And the way you organize everything, it is not just neat, it is military neat. Mac was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth he was willing to share. Long time ago, he said finally. Different life, different world. This conversation ends here, understood? Tommy nodded quickly, recognizing the tone of command that had briefly surfaced in the older man's voice. But his curiosity was now fully awakened, and he found himself studying Mac with new appreciation for the discipline that seemed to emanate from him even in the mundane tasks of facility maintenance. The afternoon meeting approached with inevitable certainty. Mac prepared for it the way he had once prepared for mission briefings, gathering all relevant information and considering possible outcomes without emotional investment in any particular result. He had learned long ago that preparation was the key to maintaining control when control was taken away from you. Karen Hayes had set up her temporary office in Conference Room B, armed with personnel files and termination paperwork. Her assistant, a nervous young woman named Janitor, had arranged the chairs to create a formal interview setting that maximized Hayes' authority while minimizing the comfort of those being evaluated. Mac arrived precisely on time, as he had been trained to do for every appointment for the past 35 years. He took the seat indicated by Hayes, his posture erect but relaxed, hands folded calmly in his lap. To an untrained observer, he appeared to be nothing more than an aging maintenance worker facing unemployment. But there was something in his eyes, a depth of experience and unshakable composure, that Hayes found unexpectedly unsettling. Mr. Sullivan, she began, consulting her prepared notes, your performance has been adequate, but we are implementing cost reduction measures that require eliminating several positions. Your salary and benefits package represents a significant expense that we can no longer justify given current budget constraints. Mac listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Hayes continued with practiced efficiency, outlining severance terms and transition timelines with the detached professionalism of someone who had conducted similar meetings throughout the week. She spoke of him as a resource allocation problem rather than a human being with 3 decades of dedicated service to his country. Hayes slid the termination paperwork across the conference table with practiced efficiency. Your last day will be Friday, she announced, giving you the standard 2 weeks to transition your responsibilities to remaining staff members. We appreciate your service to the facility and wish you well in your future endeavors. Mac examined the documents without haste, reading each clause with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in her chair as the silence stretched longer than she had anticipated. Most employees reacted with emotion at this point, either anger or pleading, both of which she knew how to manage. But Mac's calm review of the termination terms created an unexpected dynamic that left her uncertain how to proceed. The severance package is quite generous, she added, attempting to fill the silence. 2 weeks additional pay and continuation of health benefits for 30 days. That is more than many companies provide in similar circumstances. Mac looked up from the papers, meeting her eyes directly for the first time during the meeting. Is there anything else? He asked quietly. Hayes blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the simple question. She had expected negotiation, complaint, or at least some acknowledgement of the personal impact this decision would have on his life. Instead, she faced the same unreadable composure that had characterized their entire interaction. Well, no, she stammered. Unless you have questions about the transition process or need clarification on any of the terms. The HR representative will handle the administrative details and collect your access cards and equipment on Friday. Mac stood with fluid precision, the movement controlled and deliberate in a way that suggested physical conditioning maintained well beyond what his current job required. He gathered the termination documents and aligned them into a perfect stack before securing them in his shirt pocket. Thank you for your time, he said simply, and walked toward the door with the same measured stride he brought to every aspect of his work. Hayes watched him leave with growing bewilderment. In 3 years of facility management and dozens of termination meetings, she had never encountered such complete emotional control. There was something almost military in his bearing, she realized, though the thought came too late to be useful. Word of Mac's termination spread through the maintenance department with the speed of all significant news in closed communities. Some workers expressed outrage at the loss of their most reliable colleague, while others worried about increased workload and the precedent his dismissal might set for future budget cuts. Tommy found Mac in the supply room, methodically organizing cleaning materials with the same precision he brought to every task. The young man struggled with what to say, feeling the inadequacy of words in the face of such quiet dignity. "This is wrong," Tommy said finally. "You do more work than half the staff combined, and you never complain about anything. They are making a mistake." Mac continued his sorting, arranging bottles and containers with geometric precision. "Mistakes happen," he replied without bitterness. "The important thing is how you respond to them. 3 years is longer than I expected when I took this position." Tommy studied the older man's profile, noting again the alert way he held himself and the unconscious habits that spoke of training and experience far beyond civilian maintenance work. There was a story here, he realized, something that explained Mac's extraordinary composure under pressure and his ability to find meaning in work that others considered beneath their notice. The afternoon passed with unusual quiet in the maintenance department. Mac completed his assigned tasks with characteristic thoroughness, leaving detailed notes for whoever would inherit his responsibilities. He updated supply inventories, documented equipment maintenance schedules, and organized his work area with the kind of attention to detail that would make transition seamless for his replacement. As closing time approached, several co-workers stopped by to express their disappointment at losing such a reliable colleague. Mac accepted their comments with gracious acknowledgement, neither dwelling on the injustice of his situation nor seeking sympathy for circumstances beyond his control. Tommy lingered after the others had left, watching Mac secure the supply room with practiced efficiency. There was something almost ritualistic in the way the older man completed each final task, as if he were conducting a formal transfer of responsibility rather than simply finishing his last week of employment. The base around them settled into evening routine, personnel heading home to families and civilian lives while Mac Sullivan prepared to leave behind 3 years of deliberate obscurity and face an uncertain future with the same quiet strength that had carried him through challenges most people could never imagine. Thursday morning brought an unexpected complication to Mac's final week. A water pipe had burst in the administrative wing overnight, flooding 3 offices and requiring emergency cleanup before the morning briefings could proceed. The facility supervisor, overwhelmed by the scope of the damage, called in the entire maintenance crew to address the crisis. Mac arrived to find chaos where order usually prevailed. Civilian contractors stood around discussing overtime rates and equipment needs while water continued seeping under doorways and into adjoining corridors. The base operations officer, Commander Sarah Mitchell, paced frantically as she calculated the impact on scheduled meetings and classified briefings that could not be postponed. Without waiting for instructions, Mac assessed the situation with the systematic approach of someone trained to manage crises. He identified the main shut-off valve, located the source of the leak, and began coordinating repair efforts while simultaneously organizing water extraction to minimize additional damage. His movements were swift and decisive, cutting through the confusion with quiet authority that surprised everyone present. Tommy watched in fascination as Mac transformed from invisible maintenance worker into something approaching a field commander. The older man directed personnel with subtle gestures and brief instructions, somehow managing to communicate complex coordination requirements without raising his voice or appearing to take charge in any official capacity. Commander Mitchell noticed the sudden efficiency in the repair efforts and approached Mac with curiosity. "You seem to have experience managing emergency situations," she observed. Mac continued working as he responded, his hands never pausing in their methodical repair of the damaged pipe fitting. "Previous job," he said simply. "Different kind of emergencies, but the principles are similar. Assess, prioritize, execute, adapt." The commander studied him with new interest, recognizing something familiar in his approach to problem-solving. Her own military training had taught her to recognize leadership qualities regardless of rank or position, and Mac displayed the kind of competence that came from extensive experience under pressure. As the morning progressed, Mac's unofficial coordination of the cleanup efforts became increasingly apparent to everyone involved. Contractors found themselves following his suggestions without question, responding to the quiet confidence in his voice and the obvious effectiveness of his methods. The flood damage that had seemed overwhelming at dawn was under control by mid-morning, with repairs proceeding ahead of the original timeline. Have you ever watched someone take charge of a situation so naturally that everyone just instinctively follows their lead, even when they have no official authority? Sometimes real leadership has nothing to do with titles or positions. Karen Hayes arrived during the height of the cleanup efforts, her expression tight with stress over the disruption to her carefully managed schedule. She surveyed the scene with obvious displeasure, noting the additional labor costs and potential delays to normal operations. Her gaze settled on Mac with particular annoyance as she realized he was somehow central to the coordination efforts. "Mr. Sullivan," she called sharply, "this is not your responsibility. Please return to your regular duties and allow the contractors to handle the emergency repairs." Mac looked up from his work, water still dripping from his hands as he paused in securing a pipe joint. "The repair is almost complete," he said calmly. "Another 10 minutes should finish the immediate crisis." Hayes stepped closer, her authority challenged by his quiet refusal to immediately comply with her direction. "I said return to your regular duties," she repeated, her voice carrying the edge of someone unaccustomed to having her orders questioned by subordinates. The entire cleanup crew had stopped work to observe the confrontation, sensing the tension between the facility manager and the departing maintenance worker. Commander Mitchell watched with particular interest, recognizing the dynamic of a natural leader being micromanaged by someone with official authority but no real understanding of crisis management. Mac straightened slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate as he set down his tools and faced Hayes directly. The silence stretched between them as he considered his response, weighing the value of avoiding conflict against the practical needs of completing necessary work. Mac met Hayes' stare with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout their relationship, but something had shifted in the dynamic between them. The emergency had revealed capabilities that could not be easily dismissed or overlooked, and her attempt to reassert control felt increasingly hollow in the face of his obvious competence. "I understand your position," Mac said quietly, his voice carrying no challenge but also no submission. "The immediate crisis is resolved. The contractors can handle the remaining cleanup without further coordination." He gathered his tools with deliberate precision, each movement controlled and purposeful as the assembled workers watched in silence. Commander Mitchell found herself studying the older man with growing recognition of something she could not quite identify, a quality of presence that seemed inconsistent with his civilian maintenance position. Hayes watched Mac's careful compliance with frustrated awareness that she had somehow lost face in front of the emergency crew. His polite acknowledgement of her authority felt more like a tactical withdrawal than genuine deference, and she struggled to understand why a simple maintenance worker could project such quiet confidence under direct confrontation. The cleanup resumed after Mac's departure, but the efficiency that had characterized the morning's efforts noticeably diminished. Contractors returned to their previous pace and coordination problems that had been seamlessly resolved began to resurface. Commander Mitchell noted the change with professional interest, recognizing the impact that effective leadership could have even in unofficial capacities. Tommy found Mac in the equipment storage area, methodically cleaning and organizing his tools with the same attention to detail he brought to every task. The young man had observed the entire confrontation with growing admiration for the older man's ability to maintain dignity under pressure while effectively managing a complex emergency situation. "That was impressive," Tommy said quietly. "The way you handled the flood response, I mean. You made it look easy when everyone else was running around confused." Mac continued his work without looking up. "Experience teaches you that panic never improves any situation," he replied. "Clear thinking and systematic approach work better than rushing around making noise." Tommy leaned against the doorframe, watching Mac's precise movements as he arranged equipment in perfect order. The young man's military training had taught him to recognize competence when he saw it, and Mac displayed the kind of calm effectiveness that came from extensive experience in high-pressure situations. "Where did you learn to manage people like that?" Tommy asked. "I mean, nobody questioned what you told them to do, even though you are not officially in charge of anything." Mac paused in his organizing, considering how much he was willing to reveal about his background. "Leadership is not about rank or position," he said finally. "It is about competence and the willingness to take responsibility for outcomes. People respond to confidence and clear direction regardless of who provides it." The afternoon brought news that the administrative wing would be fully operational by the following morning, thanks largely to the efficient coordination of the emergency response. Commander Mitchell made a point of stopping by the maintenance department to personally thank Mac for his contribution to resolving the crisis. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, approaching him as he prepared for the evening shift. "I wanted to acknowledge your excellent work this morning. Your coordination of the repair efforts prevented what could have been a much more serious disruption to base operations." Mac looked up from his cleaning supplies, meeting her gaze with respectful attention. "Just doing what needed to be done, Commander," he replied simply. Mitchell studied his face, noting the alert intelligence in his eyes and the way he held himself with unconscious military bearing. There was something familiar about his manner, something that suggested experiences far beyond civilian maintenance work. "Have you considered applying for supervisor positions?" she asked. "Your leadership skills seem well suited to management responsibilities." Mac shook his head slightly. "I am scheduled for termination on Friday," he said without bitterness. "Budget cuts require eliminating several maintenance positions, and my salary represents a significant cost savings opportunity." Mitchell's expression shifted to surprise and then concern as she processed this information. She had rarely encountered such competence and composure in anyone, military or civilian, and the idea of losing such capability to budget considerations seemed fundamentally wrong. Commander Mitchell's concern deepened as she considered the implications of losing someone with Mac's obvious capabilities to what appeared to be a purely financial decision. She had spent enough time in military leadership to recognize exceptional talent when she encountered it, and Mac displayed qualities that could not be easily replaced or replicated. "That seems like poor resource management," she said carefully. "Have you considered appealing the decision or requesting a transfer to a different department where your skills might be better utilized?" Mac resumed organizing his equipment, his movement steady and unhurried as he considered her suggestion. "I appreciate the concern, Commander, but 3 years in any position is a reasonable run. Sometimes it is better to move on before circumstances force the decision for you." Mitchell found herself frustrated by his acceptance of what she increasingly viewed as an institutional mistake. Her own experience had taught her that truly competent people were rare and valuable regardless of their official position or current assignment. "Would you mind if I made some inquiries?" she asked. "There might be opportunities in other departments that would benefit from your experience and organizational skills." Mac looked up from his work, meeting her gaze with the same respectful attention he had shown throughout their conversation. "That is very kind of you, Commander, but unnecessary. I have learned that fighting battles you cannot win only wastes energy that could be better applied elsewhere." His response carried a weight of experience that suggested he had faced similar situations before, perhaps in contexts where the stakes were considerably higher than civilian employment. Mitchell noted the careful way he chose his words, revealing nothing specific about his background while somehow conveying depth of experience that extended far beyond maintenance work. The evening shift brought Mac to the gymnasium complex, where he performed his regular cleaning duties with characteristic thoroughness. The facility housed training equipment used by various military personnel, and Mac moved among the weights and exercise machines with the familiarity of someone who understood their proper use and maintenance requirements. A group of young SEALs had gathered for late evening training, their conversation casual and relaxed as they prepared for physical conditioning exercises. Mac worked quietly around them, emptying trash containers and mopping floors while they discussed upcoming deployment schedules and training requirements. One of the SEALs, a lean young man with alert eyes and multiple tattoos visible beneath his workout shirt, noticed Mac's efficient movement through the gym. There was something about the older man's bearing that caught his attention, a quality of controlled awareness that seemed inconsistent with his civilian maintenance uniform. The young SEAL continued his preparation while observing Mac's work patterns, noting the way the janitor positioned himself to maintain situational awareness and the unconscious habits that suggested extensive physical conditioning despite his current sedentary job requirements. What would you do if you recognized something familiar in someone you had never met before, something that made you wonder if there was more to their story than what appeared on the surface? Sometimes the most important connections happen in the most unexpected moments. As Mac moved closer to the group while cleaning nearby equipment, the young SEAL caught sight of something that made him pause in his conversation. Partially visible beneath the collar of Mac's work shirt was the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo, though the design was mostly concealed by the fabric. The SEAL's training had taught him to notice details that others might miss, and there was something about the partial tattoo that seemed significant, though he could not identify exactly what had captured his attention. The design appeared to be more than decorative, suggesting meaning that extended beyond simple personal expression. Mac completed his cleaning routine and moved toward the exit, unaware that he had been observed with such focused attention. The young SEAL watched him leave with growing curiosity about the quiet maintenance worker who carried himself with such distinctive composure and awareness. Petty Officer Jake Morrison could not shake the image of the partial tattoo he had glimpsed on the maintenance worker's shoulder. Throughout his evening training session, something about the design nagged at his memory, though he could not identify exactly what had triggered his interest. The older man's bearing and the brief glimpse of ink beneath his collar combined to create an impression that felt significant in ways Jake could not articulate. After completing his workout, Jake lingered in the gym hoping to encounter the janitor again. His SEAL training had developed his observational skills to a level where details that others might dismiss could provide crucial intelligence, and every instinct told him that Mac Sullivan was more than he appeared to be. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Mac returned to the gymnasium an hour later to address a maintenance request for one of the weight machines, carrying his tool kit with the same methodical precision Jake had observed earlier. The young SEAL positioned himself to observe while appearing to focus on equipment cleanup. As Mac knelt to examine the malfunctioning machine, his work shirt shifted slightly, revealing more of the tattoo that had captured Jake's attention. What Jake saw made his breath catch in his throat. The partial design visible on Mac's shoulder was unmistakably part of a trident, the distinctive symbol worn only by Navy SEALs who had earned the right through successful completion of the most demanding military training in the world. Jake's mind raced as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. The trident tattoo was not something worn casually or obtained by civilians. It represented years of the most grueling training, successful completion of missions that tested human limits, and membership in one of the most elite military units in existence. Yet here was a man wearing that sacred symbol while working as a base janitor, seemingly forgotten and unrecognized by everyone around him. The young SEAL struggled with how to approach this discovery. Military protocol and personal respect both demanded careful handling of what could be a sensitive situation. If Mac was indeed a former SEAL, there were reasons why he might choose to keep that background private, and Jake understood the importance of honoring such decisions. Mac completed his repair work and prepared to leave, still unaware that his carefully guarded secret had been partially revealed to someone trained to recognize its significance. Jake watched him gather his tools with the same precise attention to detail that characterized everything the older man did, noting again the unconscious habits that spoke of extensive military conditioning. Commander Mitchell appeared at the gymnasium entrance as Mac was departing, having made a point of tracking down the maintenance worker to continue their earlier conversation about his termination. She had spent the afternoon making discreet inquiries about potential opportunities for someone with Mac's demonstrated capabilities. "Mr. Sullivan," she called, catching up with him in the corridor. "I wanted to follow up on our discussion about your situation. I have been in contact with several department heads who might have positions suitable for your skills and experience." Mac paused respectfully, but Jake could see the subtle tension in his posture that suggested he was not comfortable with the attention being directed toward him. The older man had clearly invested considerable effort in maintaining his low profile, and any focus on his background or capabilities seemed to make him uneasy. "I appreciate your efforts, Commander," Mac replied carefully, but as I mentioned earlier, I am comfortable with the current arrangement. Sometimes it is better to accept circumstances rather than attempt to change what cannot be controlled. Jake observed this interaction with growing fascination, noting the way Mac deflected attention while maintaining perfect military courtesy. The contrast between his obvious competence and his deliberate self-effacement suggested someone with compelling reasons for avoiding recognition or advancement. Mitchell persisted with the dedication of an officer who recognized talent being wasted through institutional blindness. Your performance during the emergency response demonstrated leadership capabilities that this base needs, she said. It would be irresponsible to let those skills walk out the door because of budget considerations. Mac's response was polite but firm, demonstrating the kind of respectful resistance that Jake recognized from his own experience with senior personnel who preferred to avoid attention. There was something almost protective in the way the older man deflected Mitchell's well-intentioned efforts, as if recognition itself posed a threat to carefully maintained boundaries. Jake Morrison spent Thursday night researching everything he could find about seal trident tattoos and their significance within the community. His own relatively recent graduation from BUD/S training had taught him the sacred nature of the symbol and the strict tradition surrounding its display. The trident was not merely a tattoo but a declaration of identity that connected its wearer to a brotherhood forged through shared suffering and extraordinary accomplishment. The more Jake considered what he had observed, the more questions arose about Mac Sullivan's background. The precision in his work, his natural leadership during the emergency response, his ability to maintain composure under pressure, and now the glimpse of the trident all pointed toward a military history that extended far beyond what his current position would suggest. Friday morning brought Mac's final day of employment, and Jake made a point of arriving early to observe the maintenance workers' routine one last time. He found Mac in the equipment storage area, conducting what appeared to be a final inventory and organization of supplies with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized everything he did. Tommy Reeves was helping with the transition, clearly reluctant to see his mentor figure leave. The young man had developed genuine respect for Mac over their brief time working together, and his questions about the older man's background had only intensified his appreciation for the quiet dignity and competence he displayed. "It is not fair," Tommy said as they worked. "You know more about running this place than anyone, and they are letting you go to save a few dollars on the budget. Someone should speak up about what a mistake this is." Mac continued his organizing without pause, his movement steady and controlled as he prepared to transfer his responsibilities. "Fairness is not always part of the equation," he replied calmly. "The important thing is to complete your duties professionally regardless of the circumstances." Jake positioned himself where he could observe while appearing to focus on his own morning routine. He watched Mac's interactions with Tommy and noted again the natural teaching instincts and leadership qualities that seemed to emerge despite the older man's obvious preference for avoiding attention. As the morning progressed, base personnel who had worked with Mac over the past 3 years stopped by to express their appreciation for his service and regret at his departure. Each interaction followed the same pattern, with Mac accepting their comments graciously while deflecting any discussion of his personal situation or future plans. Commander Mitchell made a final attempt to convince Mac to consider alternative arrangements, arriving at the maintenance area with documentation for several potential positions that would utilize his demonstrated capabilities. Her persistence reflected genuine concern for both Mac's welfare and the base's loss of his obvious talents. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, presenting the paperwork with obvious hope, "I have identified 3 different positions that would benefit from your experience and organizational skills. The pay grades are comparable to your current position, and the work would better utilize your leadership capabilities." Mac examined the documents with polite attention, but Jake could see the subtle signs of discomfort in his posture as the focus on his background intensified. The older man clearly preferred the anonymity of his maintenance role to any position that would require explanation of his qualifications or experience. "I am grateful for your efforts, Commander," Mac said finally, "but I have already made arrangements for after my departure from this position. Sometimes it is better to move on cleanly rather than complicate transitions with additional negotiations." Jake recognized the tone of finality in Mac's response and realized that the older man had no intention of remaining on the base in any capacity. Whatever reasons had brought him to the maintenance position 3 years earlier, the same factors were now driving his decision to leave rather than accept opportunities that might require revealing more about his background. The finality of Mac's impending departure created a sense of urgency in Jake's mind as he wrestled with how to handle his discovery of the trident tattoo. Military tradition demanded respect for a fellow SEAL's privacy, but the same tradition also required recognition of the bond that connected all members of the community regardless of their current circumstances. The moment came unexpectedly during Mac's final hour on base. He was completing his last equipment check when a water cooler in the administrative hallway malfunctioned, creating a small flood that threatened to damage sensitive electronic equipment in the adjacent offices. Without hesitation, Mac responded with the same crisis management skills he had displayed during the major pipe break earlier in the week. Jake happened to be passing through the area when the incident occurred and watched as Mac immediately took charge of the situation. The older man moved with swift efficiency, shutting off water sources and coordinating with available personnel to minimize damage while arranging for proper cleanup and repair procedures. As Mac knelt to address the water shut-off valve, his work shirt pulled tight across his shoulders, fully revealing the trident tattoo that had captured Jake's attention for the past 2 days. But now Jake could see additional details that had been previously hidden. Below the trident were hash marks indicating multiple deployments, and beneath those was script lettering that Jake could just make out from his position. The words were partially obscured by Mac's movements, but Jake managed to read enough to understand their significance. The tattoo included operational designations that only someone with extensive SEAL experience would possess, along with what appeared to be unit identifiers from some of the most classified missions in recent military history. Jake's breath caught as the full implications of what he was seeing became clear. This was not simply a former SEAL working in maintenance, but someone whose tattoo suggested involvement in operations that remained classified at the highest levels. The man cleaning floors and emptying trash cans had participated in missions that most people would never know had occurred. The young SEAL found himself facing a moment that demanded decision. Military protocol required respect for operational security and individual privacy, but the same tradition that protected those secrets also demanded recognition of extraordinary service when it was encountered. Mac Sullivan had earned honors that transcended rank or current position, and Jake struggled with how to acknowledge that recognition appropriately. As Mac completed the emergency repair and prepared to gather his tools for the final time, Jake made his choice. He approached the older man with the respectful bearing his SEAL training had taught him to show towards senior community members, regardless of their current circumstances. "Sir," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for addressing someone of acknowledged expertise and experience. Mac looked up from his equipment, meeting Jake's gaze with the same calm attention he showed everyone. His expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested awareness that this interaction might be different from the casual conversations that had characterized his 3 years of anonymous service. Jake positioned himself so that their conversation would not be overheard by the civilians working nearby. He had rehearsed various approaches throughout the morning, but now found himself struggling with how to acknowledge what he had discovered without violating the obvious boundaries Mac had established around his privacy. "I wanted to thank you for your service," Jake said carefully, choosing his words to convey recognition without being specific about what he had observed. Mac's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle change that suggested Jake's comment had registered at a deeper level than simple civilian appreciation. The older man's eyes showed a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or caution, as he processed the young SEAL's carefully chosen words. "What would you do if you suddenly realized that someone you had been walking past every day was actually one of the most accomplished people you had ever encountered? Sometimes the greatest heroes are hiding in plain sight." Mac studied Jake's face with new intensity, his trained awareness picking up on details that indicated this was not a casual expression of gratitude. Something in the young man's bearing and the precise way he had approached suggested knowledge that extended beyond what Mac's current position would normally reveal to base personnel. The silence stretched between them as Mac evaluated Jake's approach and the careful formality in his tone. Years of operational experience had taught him to read people quickly and accurately, and something in the young man's bearing suggested knowledge that extended far beyond casual appreciation for maintenance work. Jake took a breath and made his decision. "The tattoo, sir," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I recognize the significance." Mac's entire demeanor shifted in response to those words. The careful anonymity he had maintained for 3 years suddenly felt fragile as he realized that his deliberately concealed identity had been discovered by someone with the training to understand what they were seeing. His eyes sharpened with the alert awareness of someone whose cover had been compromised. "You have good eyes," Mac said after a long moment, his voice carrying a different quality than the casual tone he had used for civilian interactions. "But good eyes should also know when to look away from things that are not their concern." Jake held his position with respectful persistence, recognizing the subtle warning in Mac's response but unwilling to simply walk away from what he had discovered. His SEAL training had taught him that some encounters demanded courage even when the outcome was uncertain. "With respect, sir, I cannot look away from this," Jake replied. "Not when I see someone who has earned recognition being treated as if they were invisible. My training taught me to honor the community, and that includes acknowledging service when I encounter it." Mac studied the young SEAL with growing assessment of both his courage and his potential understanding of the complexities involved. The older man had spent considerable effort building his anonymous existence, and the prospect of having that carefully constructed invisibility disrupted created tensions he had hoped to avoid. "You do not understand the full situation," Mac said carefully. "Sometimes recognition brings complications that make anonymity preferable. There are reasons why some people choose to step away from what they were and find peace in simpler circumstances." Jake absorbed this response with the respect due to someone whose experience clearly extended far beyond his own. But his conviction remained unshaken even as he acknowledged the complexity Mac was trying to convey. "I understand that there are things I cannot know, sir," Jake said with quiet determination. "But I also understand that every SEAL earns respect that should not be forgotten simply because they choose to serve in different ways. Whatever brought you to this position, it does not diminish what you accomplished before." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Base Commander Colonel Patricia Reeves, who had come to personally thank Mac for his years of reliable service before his departure. Colonel Reeves was known throughout the base for her attention to personnel welfare and her practice of personally acknowledging the contributions of departing civilian employees. "Mr. Sullivan," Colonel Reeves said as she approached, "I wanted to express my personal appreciation for your 3 years of excellent service to this facility. Your reliability and professionalism have been noted and appreciated by personnel throughout the base." Mac straightened to acknowledge the colonel's attention, his bearing unconsciously shifting to the respectful posture ingrained by decades of military conditioning. Jake watched this interaction with fascination, noting the subtle but unmistakable signs of military bearing that emerged when Mac was addressed by senior authority. "Thank you, Colonel," Mac replied. "It has been an honor to serve in whatever capacity was needed." Colonel Reeves studied Mac with the experienced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating personnel. Something in his bearing and the precision of his response suggested background that extended beyond typical civilian maintenance experience, though she could not identify exactly what had captured her attention. Jake realized this was the moment when Mac's true identity would either remain hidden or be revealed, and the young SEAL found himself holding his breath as he watched the interaction between the departing maintenance worker and the base commander who had the authority to change everything if she understood what she was encountering. Jake Morrison made the decision that would change everything. As Colonel Reeves prepared to conclude her farewell remarks, the young SEAL stepped forward with the kind of courage that defined his training and his commitment to honoring the brotherhood he had sworn to uphold. "Colonel," Jake said respectfully, requesting permission to speak freely about Mr. Sullivan. Mac's eyes flashed with warning, but Jake had already committed to his course of action. Colonel Reeves turned her attention to the young SEAL with curiosity about what had prompted his formal intervention in what should have been a routine departure acknowledgement. "Permission granted, Petty Officer Morrison," the colonel replied, noting the unusual formality in his request. Jake took a breath and rendered a crisp salute directly to Mac Sullivan, his bearing shifting to the rigid attention reserved for addressing senior military personnel of exceptional accomplishment. "Sir," he said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the corridor, "I request permission to properly acknowledge your service to our community and our nation." The salute hung in the air like a declaration, impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Mac found himself facing the moment he had spent 3 years trying to avoid, his carefully maintained anonymity shattered by a gesture that demanded recognition and explanation. Colonel Reeves stared at the tableau in growing comprehension, her experienced assessment of personnel suddenly recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the departing maintenance worker. The formal salute from a Navy SEAL to a civilian employee could mean only one thing, and the implications sent shockwaves through her understanding of the situation. "Mr. Sullivan," Colonel Reeves said slowly, her voice carrying new weight as she began to grasp what she was witnessing, "perhaps you would be willing to clarify Petty Officer Morrison's gesture for my understanding." Mac remained silent for a long moment, weighing 3 years of deliberate obscurity against the honor being offered by Jake's recognition. The young SEAL held his salute with unwavering determination, refusing to lower his hand until Mac acknowledged the respect being rendered. Finally, Mac straightened to full military bearing, his posture transforming from that of a maintenance worker to something far more commanding. With measured precision, he returned Jake's salute with the crisp acknowledgement of someone accustomed to receiving such honors. "Commander Marcus Sullivan, retired," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority that 3 years of janitor work had never quite suppressed. The words hit Colonel Reeves like physical impact as she realized she was standing before someone whose reputation extended far beyond anything she had imagined possible. Commander Sullivan was a legend within special operations circles, credited with missions that remained classified but were whispered about with awe throughout the military community. Jake lowered his salute with satisfaction, knowing he had done what honor demanded despite the personal cost Mac might face for the exposure of his identity. The young SEAL understood that some principles transcended individual preferences, and recognizing extraordinary service was one of those non-negotiable values. "Sir," Jake said with quiet intensity, "it has been an honor to serve on the same base, even if I was too blind to recognize it until now." Colonel Reeves struggled to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. For 3 years, one of the most decorated special operations commanders in Navy history had been cleaning floors and emptying trash cans under her command, and no one had recognized the extraordinary resource they possessed. "Commander Sullivan," she said, her voice reflecting both shock and growing anger at the institutional blindness that had allowed this situation to develop, "I believe we need to have a very serious discussion about your future with this command. What does it mean to you when someone finally receives the recognition they have always deserved? Sometimes the most important moments happen when courage meets honor and refuses to let greatness go unacknowledged." Mac looked at Jake with something approaching gratitude mixed with resignation, understanding that his 3 years of peaceful anonymity were permanently ended but acknowledging the nobility in the young man's refusal to let service go unrecognized. The transformation from invisible maintenance worker to acknowledged hero was complete, and Naval Base Coronado would never be the same.